Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Asian Vision Dialogue. Today, I have the great pleasure to have our guest speaker, Dr. Digby Rand. He is Senior Special Advisor to the Institute of International Relations of Cambodia at the Royal Academy of Cambodia. And today, we're going to talk about another important topic, which is the global climate talk, priorities and challenges at the COP28. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rand to our program.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Yes,
Yes.
It's a great pleasure to be with you again. I enjoy very much the AVI dialogue, so I'm very happy to join you this time on something very important.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Rand, for being here with us once again. And
my pleasure.
It's our great pleasure to have you to discuss the important topic today.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so can we start our discussion now?
Sure.
Yeah. So, of course, as you may know that the COP28 is being hosted by the United Arab Emirates in Dubai from 30th November to 12th December. But before we jump into the main parts of our discussion, so can you tell us a little bit what is COP28 and why is it important?
Yeah, yes. Well, the COP just means the Conference of Parties, and the parties are, of course, the 198 countries that make up the world's structure, political structure of nation states, and of course, COP28. So we've been doing this a long time. This has been going on a very, very long time. But you know, progress has been made, but it's very, very slow. So the main focus, or foci, if you like, the main foci this year is really trying to get an appreciation of the requirement for haste. We need to speed this up, and most particularly, we need to speed up the reduction of emissions. And so COP28 is really focused on the reduction of emissions. That's number one. And so there's some announcements already, things that have been kind of organized. So obviously, you know, the transition into renewable energy, that's fairly obvious, but it's not happening nearly as fast as people think it is. You know, you see wind turbines and solar power everywhere, but actually it's still only a very small proportion. And so getting emissions cut is going to be very, very difficult. And of course that brings up questions about why the UAE is going to host this, because they're the 7th largest oil producer in the world. And then there's some other things about political things. So for example, Gaza and Ukraine, that's also going to come into it.
Oh, right.
And yeah, I think even on the first day, some of the speakers have already been talking about that, because it has an impact, a very severe impact on supply chains, energy chains, specifically energy. So, you know, when it comes to pollution, energy is where it's at. So, those are going to be the really key talking points. But I think also institutional kind of arrangements, though, that people can progress to the next step. You see, you've got to put in things that everybody's willing to agree to.
Yes, yeah.
And so that's obviously the next step. And so the big push here is for emissions.
All right, yes, thank Dr. Rand. Of course, when we talk about the COP28, there will be more something to mention, like what will be the world leader who will join the COP28.
Yes.
So, and there's a remarkable note that President Biden skipped this conference this year. So, what factor?
It's an all-star cast.
Yeah.
I mean, even the Pope is going. I'm not quite sure what that means, but the Vatican is not really a country. But look, it's a symbol, right? And that's very important. I think so many leaders are going. I don't know the exact number, but it's really a lot. But yes, clearly absent are Joseph Biden, the President of the United States, and Xi Jinping, the President of China. They're both not going to be there. But look, in real terms, I mean, Biden's been there the last 2 years. Xi Jinping has not. But that's not really, I think the view of most academics or let's say analysts is that really, because the COP process doesn't really come with solid specific outcomes, it's only suggestions and sort of pushing forward the negotiations and the frameworks, outcomes are not going to be sure. So, you know, why would you go, if the two big ones, so China and the US, why would they go if they don't know what the outcome is going to be, you see? It really, I think, that's the calculation in Washington. That's also the calculation in Beijing. They want to turn up when there's going to be something signed, a big outcome, and they can take the glory, if you like, and say that they led that. Well, that's not going to happen, and so that's why Biden and Xi Jinping are not there. This phase, we're going to push through into, the idea here is to push through into accelerating the reduction of emissions, and I think the damage and loss part is the first big success. That was happened today, right? But because those outcomes are not clear, that's why Biden and Xi Jinping are not going to go. They want to go when there's going to be something really signed and everybody, and they can take the glory and say the USA did this or China really led this, you see. Other than that, I think everybody else is there. And look, Kamala Harris, the VP, has been quickly kind of organised to be there. But, the former Secretary of State, John Kerry,
yes.
He's been appointed the ambassador for climate change, so he's going to be there, right? He really is hands-on, he knows. So I think that's relatively okay, to be honest. And the same is true for the Chinese side.
Yes.
And everybody else is there, so I think that'll work out. I wouldn't be too worried about it.
All right, yes. That's very insightful. Thanks, Doctor. So when we talk about another important thing, that is the United Arab Emirates being the host country, that's a little bit kind of controversial.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, what role does the United Arab Emirates influence the negotiation and discussion in this conference? Yes.
Well, besides the sort of the global kind of transition that's going on in power and wealth that we're all talking about, what is it? Changes unseen in 100 years, right? That kind of famous phrase that Xi Jinping used with Vladimir Putin. I think that's important, but it's obvious that the Middle East and all the big oil producers, they have to be included in the whole process, and the UAE is fairly carefully balanced between the blocs, if you like. They've been cooperating with the Americans, with the Chinese, with the Saudis, and with BRICS. So the UAE is now in the BRICS. Yes. So I think that's very, very important. And that's sort of counterbalancing this kind of unipolar American power, right? We know that transition's happening. So mostly the people that are criticising the UAE on the idea that, if you're selling oil, you can't be involved in environmental activity. That's not true. I mean, all of these oil producers need to transition, and they are transitioning. And I think the first thing that we can see here is this very important loss and damage arrangement where the rich countries who have produced most of the pollution in the world over the last 150, 200 years, they are going to indemnify or pay or help poor countries adjust. And that's a big outcome, and that really started in the very smallest of countries, Vanuatu, population of like 500,000 or something, and, in the Pacific Ocean. So that's very, very important, and they've got it this far is fantastic. Whether or not the rich countries, especially under the present economic circumstances for the global north, Europe and America are in recession, whereas everywhere else is not, I think that's where they're going to find the money. I think in the past, clearly they've promised lots of money, but they haven't delivered. And always I think that the Americans are going to be upset that India and China get a better deal. So they're two large countries, populations and so forth, and the Americans don't want to let them have any kind of advantageous position because they're developing. Do you see what I mean? Like transfer of wealth from the north to China, that's going to be really difficult, I think. Yeah. But for the other smaller countries, of course, it's good. And a key part of that for the UAE is the UAE has lots of surplus money, and they've just announced that they're going to invest up to $70 billion into environmental funds and to advance environmental technologies and the implementations and all these sorts of things, reduction of use of fossil fuels in their own country and in their own economy. I think it's clear, that's forward-looking. So criticising them just for being an oil producer and then therefore they're not allowed to I think that's not fair at all. And look, they're clearly at the centre of action at the moment, just with all of the global politics, and as I said, they're part of BRICS as well, and BRICS controls 60% of the world's oil supplies and gas supplies. So I think that's very, very important, actually. I think that Dubai is hosting this is a good move. You cannot exclude anybody just because, they produce oil. Everybody needs to develop. That all has to be, we have to be very careful about all of these arrangements, can have negative effects as well on development, you see. And then if you think about geoeconomic moves and geopolitical moves from some of the powers, perhaps they're trying to slow the development of some countries. I mean, this is obvious with the US and China, right? That's clearly stated. But look, I think it's also true of anybody that might support or, let's say, oppose US intentions, for example. So, look, I think the UAE is that's very important, and it signals to all of the oil producers and the Middle East and the Muslim countries, which is a lot of countries, for example, Indonesia, Malaysia, etc. I think it's very, very important. Cambodia has a significant Islamic population, etc. So I think that's very important.
All right. Yes, that's very interesting, Doctor.
Thank you.
You have mentioned a lot about kinds of the significant roles of the UAE to play in this conference, but we would like to know what do you foresee the challenges in the negotiation process, for example, like you said about loss and damage fund or something?
Sorry, I said 70 billion, but it's not, it's 30 billion.
30 billion.
Yeah. So that's the first thing, I suppose, major oil producer. Well, the challenges. The first challenge is institutional. Just getting everybody to actually get through negotiations and start working. And, this COP28, we're talking 198 questions, thousands, I mean, really thousands. There will be tens of thousands of people there for 2 weeks. And, just getting all of this together, and there are so many small, but the biggest hurdle is trying to get consensus, right? So each sort of special group, so for emissions, for funding, for plastics, for all the sorts of things, there's different little groups, work groups for everything. And of course the biggest problem is standardization, like approach the problem with the same approach.
Oh, yeah.
Share the approach.
Yeah.
That's very, very difficult. And there's all these political movements, right? And of course we can see that the United States is right now in the process of ramping up their oil production because they have to supply Europe now. So they're ramping up rapidly. I think they've increased their oil production, their fossil fuel production, something like 100% in the last 10 years. I mean, it's really massive. So now the Russians are doing the same. The Venezuelans are now allowed to go back into the market. Iran's gone back into the market. So actually, you can see that all the turmoil over territory and so forth is actually generating the opposite effect of what you want. It's increasing oil supply, not decreasing it. And it's increasing the need for nuclear, not decreasing it. Same with the natural gas and so forth. And so that actually takes energy away from renewables. So this is very problematic. So underlying all of this stuff, you say, okay, here are the geopolitical realities. And hang on a second, there's more oil being pumped. So the prime concern is emissions, but the political situation is actually forcing all these people, or they're taking choices to increase their production of oil. Well, that's a contradiction, isn't it? Right. So I think that's a fundamental problem and a really big problem. The other thing, of course, is, for example, just the standardization and getting these consensus groups to work. It's very, very complex. And it takes a lot of time and very, very skillful negotiation. It's arduous, and that's why we're up to COP28, not like COP3 or something. And I expect this will go to COP50 eventually. But yeah, those are the big points, I think. It's going to be difficult. And financial support, I suppose, is the number one thing.
Oh, yeah.
Because Cambodia is not responsible for any of, Cambodia's emissions are like 0.0001% of global.
Yes, yeah.
So, asking Cambodia, a poor developing country, to suddenly just sort of switch to something more expensive and do it rapidly, it's impossible. And there's so many other countries like that, at least 100 like that. So that's going to be really problematic, how this money is going to be distributed. It's through the World Bank. That's also slightly problematic because that still has a veto by the US. So if they don't like you, they'll veto it. So I'm not keen on the World Bank holding power over this fund. I don't think that's really necessary, but that's the way it is. And anyway, it's a step forward, but there are these sorts of problems, you see. We can see that there's avenues for all of the participants, the big participants, to veto, slow down, and so forth. And even though they're publicly, with narratives and the media and everything saying, oh, it's all absolutely necessary, the geopolitical realities just under that are actually creating more and more problems to achieve these outcomes, regardless. So I think that's very problematic. I don't have a solution, but I think that's the analysis that we have to be aware of, that there's a real contradiction here in global politics and then trying to get to COP28 resolutions and implement them. That's a conflict going on there immediately, and so you can see already that there's real problems.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, with regard to Cambodia, actually, other developed country that like produce a lot of emission can buy kinds of carbon credits from Cambodia.
Yes, well, that's always good, isn't it? Carbon credits are great, you know, and Tesla is making a fortune out of selling carbon credits to the other car manufacturers in America because they're not really producing electric, right? So, you know, you get a Tesla that gets subsidized by like $7,500 by the US government. So China's doing the same thing, but you can see that both governments keep saying that they're not acting fairly, right?
Yeah.
But they're both doing the same thing in real terms. And I suppose that the Germans and the Japanese are going to be forced to do the same with the car industry as it switches to EV and battery production and so forth. And there's an essential kind of structural problem with supply chains in there that needs to be resolved, and that often, I think, has negative impact on all of these kind of climate negotiations in real terms.
Yes.
And we know that the world leaders have already made speeches about, you know, Gaza and Ukraine and everything else, and how that impacts climate change. But what are they really able to do about it, you see? Yeah.
Yes.
So that's problematic.
All right, thanks so much, Dr. Ren.
Oh, I just wanted to say about Cambodia that, you know, the new Prime Minister has just announced that and that very good timing, right? Excellent timing. So the new coal-fired power plant has been cancelled.
All right, yes.
And it's going to be replaced with liquid natural gas. It's a marginal improvement, but it's an improvement. It's definitely cleaner, and it'll, you know, it's good for 20 years, maybe 20 years, 30 years. It's possible. But yeah, you can see that that's only a marginal step towards cleaner, even though it's less emissions. It's still fossil fuels.
Yeah, we
but
try to
just slightly cleaner, right?
Sure.
So yeah, it's going to take a very long time. But countries like Cambodia have the opportunity to do the leap, what you call the technology leap, where they don't really have to go through all the old technologies to get to the new. Basically, Cambodia and many other countries can get much faster to new. And I think China has a really important role in that because it's the largest producer. 60% of all the renewable energy in the world is produced by China.
Yes.
And the equipment, the technology, all of the wind power turbines and batteries and so forth, more than 70% coming out of China.
Yes.
So, and you can see that the Europeans and the Americans, you know, are worried about that because they think, oh, the Chinese will control the renewable energy supply chain. But that's not really I don't think the Chinese aim was to do that, but that's how it's come up. You know, that's now how it looks to those in Washington and perhaps in Berlin as well. Or Brussels, starting to look that way. But really, I don't think China's got a comparative advantage, and they're using it. And they're the biggest country in the world. They want to get there the fastest, and they're trying to do that. And so it's very strange to hear all these sort of criticisms about their being, you know, the world's biggest polluter. But then you say, well, yeah, it's also the world's biggest manufacturer, exporter, trader. So all that pollution could have been put somewhere else, right? The factory could be somewhere else, but it's not. So China is in fact forced to be the world's largest enabler.
Yeah.
And it has to transition the fastest, which is what it's doing, which also scares the existing powers, especially in Europe and America, that China is going to get to renewable non-emissions and so forth faster. And it's already met all these standards already, SDGs 2030. Well, China's already ahead on all of those.
All right.
Whereas every other country in the world is behind.
Right.
So,
Good news.
you know, there's a real problem in the narrative as well, because that's also kind of obscured in the political you see, and the facts about who's actually producing renewable and how much and where and everything is really obscured, and that becomes evident in the COP28. And you could imagine that if Xi Jinping and Biden were there, perhaps Biden wouldn't come out looking so good.
I see. Yes, thank you, Doctor. We would like to wrap up our discussion and would like to know your perspective looking beyond the COP28. What would be the expected outcomes or kind of agreement that can influence the current global climate governance in the years to come? Can you say a little bit?
Well, that's the idea, right, behind the whole thing. The concept is that this conference of parties it can continue to push forward the agenda to get toward a fossil-free world. Fundamentally a fossil-free world. But not just that, of course, there's all the other pollution and energy things related, like plastics and pollution and so forth. So, look, that is all moving forward very, very slowly. But as I said earlier, there are so many counter voices, or not voices, but activities related to conflict and contestation and competition that have meant that the advanced economies have not been able to make their transition to renewable as quickly as they would like to, and now they're producing more oil, and there's more oil going to go on the market, and the prices are high, and all this sort of thing, and Europe's in terrible trouble because of energy prices. So this has got to be really part of that's going to be talked about in a lot of back rooms for the next 2 weeks about just how that's going to be resolved. And there's some very clear and obvious examples, and that is that Europe should never have been cut from Russian energy. That was just a very stupid thing to do. So now they're scrambling to correct that, right? But that doesn't work in favour of renewables. So that's one of the big challenges coming up, is how that is going to be balanced. And that really relies on other things like multipolarity and the multilateral frameworks. So that's going forward. That's institutional, multilateral. So the Americans have said that they're very interested in that. But the Chinese are much more practical and pragmatic, and they want to see people just adopting renewable, and China produces lots of it. And so please buy as many of these fans as, turbines and batteries and EV as fast as you can. And China has set the example, actually. It produces most of the EVs in the world, most of the batteries in the world, etc., etc. So they're going to be a big player, and I think the Americans are going to have to get to grips with that. Whereas investment in renewables through the markets in New York and everything else have been going down. So investment is actually dropping in renewables in the United States and in Europe and in Japan, right? Because their economies are in recession. The US is not in recession, but it's technically so close that you may as well say it's in recession. And I think that is the great fear going forward, actually, is that the American economy cannot support this, and that will mean more oil, more fossil fuels, etc., because they're cheap. So that's going to be problematic going forward. Look, the best thing in all honesty, what I believe is that countries, all the small countries, like Cambodia, that are all sort of joining together within BRICS and other conferences, the G77 and all that sort of thing, they have to be more active, and they're going to have to work much closer with the Chinese because the Chinese have the best technology in renewables. It's the obvious way to go. So Belt and Road is a really good avenue for that. How the Europeans, Americans are going to be involved in this, putting up this money they've promised, I'd like to see it. If it happens, I don't think it's going to happen. They won't put up all of it. They just don't have enough money. So that's very problematic. So I see this is going to be a repetitive process, very small institutional changes, set some new targets, but at the end of the day, I think there won't be anything really big coming out of COP28 other than this loss and damage agreement. That's okay. But if the money doesn't follow, which is probably what's going to happen, that's difficult. So yes, all these other geopolitical equations are affecting COP28 so badly. And I think that fundamentally means Biden and Xi Jinping can't go because the outcome is not known and probably very limited. So I know it's pessimistic, but that's really where we're at.
might take longer time. Yeah.
Yes, much longer, which is not good.
Okay.
Especially if you're on a small island in the Pacific or something, right? You're just countries disappearing, which is the case of some of these islands, of course. But not just these islands, other places as well. You know, they're losing. The Great Barrier Reef, for example, is being destroyed, and so many other natural wonders or locations where, you know, fish breed or whatever it is. So that all, see this, it's so complex if you think about that. Food supply, energy supply, the logistics supply, manufacturing industry, all relies on this, right? So trying to get everybody to say we're actually really going to do it and pay for it.
Right.
History doesn't paint a pretty picture for this, right?
Yeah.
So I'm very pessimistic. Sorry.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Doctor. That's very insightful. So I think we gonna
call it there?
Yeah. Yes. All.
Okay.
So thank you very much, Dr. Ren.
My pleasure.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for being here and have a productive discussion today. I look forward to having you again in the next future.
My pleasure.
Yes.
Thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Asian Vision Dialogue has now come to an end. Thank you for watching.